Hi, you're on the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. Do you have any idea what a police state looks like? ProphecyNewsWatch.com ran an article this week, and they said it's not news that globalists have been at work for the last several generations seeking to bring the world's population under control. They do so largely because they believe it to be more efficient and certainly more safe. But what does it look like? Well, since 9/11, there have been incremental steps toward what many liberty advocates would call a police state. This is a system in which governments are no longer restricted by the boundaries of civil liberties and are given the power to do just about anything they want in the name of public safety. The fact is, the use of the law as a tool for injecting tyranny into a culture is the first tactic of all totalitarians. The idea that by simply writing government criminality into the law books, criminality somehow becomes justified by virtue of legal recognition. It's all very circular. Whenever government abuse of the people is initiated, it's always initiated in the name of what's best for society as a whole. To save society, the individuals that make up the society must be sublimated, in some cases actually destroyed. This mentality is the complete opposite of what the founding fathers in America fought and died for. But as Thomas Jefferson once said, rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law because the law is often but the tyrant's will, and also, or always so, when it violates the rights of the individual. In countries like Australia, which claim to value Western democratic principles of liberty and rule by the people, the perception is that civil rights are codified into the legal framework just as they are here in the U.S. However, there are some glaring differences and some issues. Specifically, Australian citizens, like many European citizens, have absolutely no means to compel their government or the elites that influence their government to limit themselves. It is these nations in which the populations have been mostly disarmed and pacified that any agenda for tyranny will first be established. For many years now, there have been numerous analysts, economists, geopolitical experts in the alternative media that have predicted and warned the public about the globalist strategy of order out of chaos. In other words, the ultra-wealthy power brokers that hold influence over most governments on Earth seek to reshape the existing social order through the creation of crisis and disaster. And by engineering public desperation, they hope to lure us into accepting restrictions on our freedoms that we would have never considered otherwise. The goal of a single global economy and government has often been spoken of by elites time and time again, yet is still to this day called a conspiracy theory or a paranoid delusion. I could quote these elites and their organizations all day long, but I'll give you just a few choice statements to make my point. An elitist and Fabian socialist, a man by the name of H.G. Wells, outlined in his nonfiction treatise, The New World Order, writing, "When the struggle seems to be drifting definitely toward a world social democracy, there may still be very great delays and disappointments before it becomes an efficient and beneficent world system. Countless people will hate the New World Order and will die protesting against it. When we attempt to evaluate its promise, we have to bear in mind the distress of a generation or so of malcontents, many of them quite gallant and graceful-looking people." Former Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton and Council of Foreign Relations member Strobe Talbott wrote in an article for Time magazine in 1992 entitling it "America Abroad, the Birth of the Global Nation." He wrote, "In the next century, nations as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority." In the next century. He wrote this when? 1992. The house of world order, he calls it, will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. Members of globalist foundations and think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations have inhabited nearly every U.S. government office and presidential cabinet for the past several decades. And this includes the 24 or so CFR members in Donald Trump's cabinet. Draining the swamp? Not going to happen. Harper's Magazine candidly revealed in a 1958 expose entitled School for Statesmen, writing that the most powerful clique in these CFR groups have one objective in common. They want to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty and the national independence of the United States. They want to end national boundaries and racial and ethnic loyalties supposedly to increase business and ensure world peace. What they strive for would inevitably lead to dictatorships and loss of freedoms by the people. The CFR was founded for the purpose of promoting disarmament and submergence of the U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government. The easiest method for the globalist was to get what they openly say they want, to either conjure a crisis or exploit an existing crisis in order to erode sovereignty. The current pandemic fits this plan perfectly. But before sovereignty can be eliminated on a national level, they need to undermine sovereignty on an individual level. Actions within the U.S. and nations allied to the U.S. suggest an accelerated attack on personal liberties is at hand. There are sister foundations to the CFR in many other countries. For example, in Australia, they have the highly embedded, influential Strategic Policy Institute, which has been consistently advocating for complete centralization of government power in the wake of a coronavirus pandemic. At the very least, they are test running their strategy and using Australians as guinea pigs. When the ASPI says they plan to keep the pandemic changes in place well after the virus is gone, they aren't just talking about shifting into a digital economy. Right now, Australia and New Zealand are slamming citizens with perhaps the most draconian measures yet in the Western world. The policies are that the elites want to introduce everywhere, but they're going full bore in Australia, and it just seems to be getting worse. In various areas of Australia, Level 4 response measures have been enforced for at least the next 6 weeks, including curfews, strict mask policies, including people being forced to wear masks outside, contrary to everything science and virology has yet to say about low possibility of transition in sunlight and open air. Residents are not allowed to travel more than 3 miles from their homes, and only one person from a household is allowed to leave at any given time. Citizens violating these rules are subject to $10,000 fines or arrest. And yes, people are being arrested simply for not wearing a mask or being too far from home. In New Zealand, the situation has become exceedingly grim and should be treated as a warning to Americans, specifically as to our potential future, as we allow the narrative of public health security to be turned into a vehicle for tyranny. While Australia has been using quarantine facilities to force people considered high risk to isolate, New Zealand quarantine camps are now fully under the control of the military, and all citizens who test positive are suspected to have COVID and can be separated from their families and placed in these camps, which are hotels converted into prisons. It is the complete erasure of personal liberties, all because of an increase in cases which has amounted to 525 deaths in Australia and 22 deaths in New Zealand. Now I would remind you, as quoted in the first segment of this week's program, The World in Turmoil, the number of corona deaths in the U.S., deaths solely from the coronavirus now number about 9,700 nationwide. The author of this piece believes the reason Australia and New Zealand have been targeted with this level of restriction first is because they have been almost fully disarmed and have no means to defend themselves from government overreach. Elites and globalists within the U.S. are calling for hard lockdowns for at least 6 weeks, just like the level 4 lockdowns in Australia. Federal Reserve member Neel Kashkari recently asserted that Americans are saving more, thus they should be subjected to hard lockdowns because they can afford it. Virginia is planning mandatory COVID vaccinations, even though vaccines for SARS-like viruses have proven impossible to develop in the past, and rushed vaccines have a history of harming or killing people rather than protecting them. Not counting the issue that giving government the power to force citizens to inject anything into their bodies is immoral. So what's next? COVID camps? Well, yeah, unless Americans make a hard stand. Mainstream media outlets have been suggesting this strategy for months. The Washington Post applauded the use of forced isolation camps in other nations and asks why the U.S. has not yet used them beyond ports of foreign travelers. The reason is that many Americans will not go along with such measures and will use force in kind against anyone trying to lock them up because of a virus that is a moderate threat at most to a small percentage of population. Duh. And U.S. citizens have more weapons than our entire standing army and all of our police departments put together. That said, don't assume the establishment will not eventually try it. They will. Be ready when they do. Look to the actions in places like Australia and New Zealand and ask yourself, am I willing to go along with that? And if so, for how long? Because the globalists intend for these restrictions to become the new normal worldwide. And oh, by the way, the Bible describes just this sort of situation in the end times. A global, controlling government determined to bring everyone under their authority or execute them. And why? Because this is the master plan of the enemy of your soul. How do you condition a world of people to accept such tactics? We may be learning today.